Hello, welcome to day 6 of Unit 4. Today we're talking about the Sepoy Rebellion, or Sepoy Mutiny, or India's first war of independence. Depending on who you ask, it's the same event, just different names. Question number 1. How were the events at Meerut a mutiny? Well, a mutiny is defined as an open rebellion against the proper authorities, especially by soldiers or sailors against their officers. So how was this event a mutiny? First of all, let's remember what happened. At Meerut, a portion of the Bengali regiment here rebelled, and a particular individual, Mangal Pandey, depicted here in the movie, and in the movie about him, and depicted here as he appears on the postage stamp that he was commemorated in. The movie is called The Rising, and if you want to watch it, it dramatizes these events moderately accurately. So this guy, Pandey, led some kind of uprising. Was it a mutiny or was it a revolution? Was it a rebellion? So the soldiers of the Bengali regiment were upset about the cartridges for the new Enfield rifle. This is the new rifle. It's more accurate. It can shoot for farther distances, but it requires that the soldier bite the top of a greased cartridge off this piece of paper. You bite it with your teeth. You spit out this bit. You pour the gunpowder and the bullet into the gun. You tamp it down and you shoot it. It's the biting off portion that is the problem. If you recall from our previous class, the rumor spread that they were greased with pig fat and or cow fat. This, of course, offended both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. Hindu soldiers refused to be defiled by putting cow fat in their mouths, and likewise Muslim soldiers were upset about the idea of putting pork fat in their mouths. So despite the fact that the British leadership claimed that the offensive cartridges had been replaced with vegetable fat, the soldiers were still offended, and they were already conditioned to be upset with the British for all of the reasons we've talked about previous to this class. So Pandey tried to rile up his fellow soldiers into a revolt of some kind. He tried to rile everybody up. He actually kind of went nuts on his own. He went on a rampage. He shot some British officers, and then shot himself in an attempt at suicide. He was captured, not killed, put on trial, and then eventually he was ruled to be guilty and he was hanged. But he became a kind of a hero, and this event is sort of the event that everybody points to as having kicked off the rebellion. Was this a mutiny? Well, in response to this, lots of other soldiers refused to use the new cartridges, to use the new guns. Many of them were imprisoned. And then after about 30 days, when those men were released from prison, after the events of Mangal Pandey, the soldiers rebelled. So most of the rebellion happened in the area here at the north of the map, in the area around Delhi and Jhansi. And it was widely seen as a military mutiny because it was the members of the Bengali regiment and members of the ruling classes in this region fighting against the British military. So it was seen as soldiers fighting against their commanders, soldiers refusing to follow orders, as the thing that started it all. Side note, interestingly, the British military had 3 other regiments available: the Madras Regiment, the Bombay Regiment, and the Punjabi Regiment here. For example, the 23rd Sikh Pioneers remained loyal to the British East India Company. It was only the Bengali Regiment that rebelled. Number 2, how was fighting so brutal during the 1857 war, and why was this the case? So there's 2 things going on here: sieges and massacres. A siege is when an enemy surrounds a town or building, cutting off the supplies with the goal of the surrender of the people inside. So we have several sieges. One, the siege of Jhansi, which was done by the British. The British surrounded the kingdom, the country of Jhansi, and Rani Lakshmi Bai, who we've talked about before, the Queen of Jhansi, led a fight to fight off the British to end the siege. And in the end, when she broke out of the city with her soldiers, she put on armor, she got on a horse, she had her saber, and she actually fought hand to hand with the British. She comes to a pretty violent but epic end in a fight on horseback. She's unhorsed by a saber blow by another soldier, and she's left to bleed to death on the roadside. But of course, she wasn't dead yet. So she waited, and when the soldier who had unhorsed her came back by, she was waiting, and she shot him with a pistol. He, before dying, shot her with his carbine, and she died there on the side of the road, but not before getting her revenge on the soldier who killed her, or who stabbed her. This siege was the British surrounding the Indians, and the Indians, led by Rani Lakshmi Bai, fought back. Similarly, there's a siege of a place called Lucknow, where the Indians surrounded the British. The British, terrified of the Indian rebellion, retreated to the inside of a residence, and they were surrounded by Indian soldiers. At this siege, the civilians inside were stuck for over 87 days with no additional food. They ran out of food pretty quickly, and their only water source was from a very vulnerable location where people who went to get water from the well were shot at. Many people died in this siege, and far more people died from disease and hunger and the foul conditions inside than were shot. This also brings us to a different siege, the siege of Kanpur, which happened a couple of 60 miles away from there. Europeans were hiding in barracks buildings. They had no convenient defenses. They were shot at and surrounded for 20 days, at which point it was negotiated a truce for the women and children to get walked down to the river to be evacuated. However, the evacuation went wrong, and somehow somebody shot someone, and it all chaos broke loose. This led us to the Bibigar massacre, the women and children and men trying to get the women and children onto these boats, many of whom were killed in the water. Only like 8 people escaped from this. Most of the women and children were marched into Bibigar, which is means like the women's house, a house, and most of the men were shot. Then, after staying prisoner in the Bibigar house for a while, the women and children themselves were lined up to be executed, shot at. Those that weren't killed in the execution by firing squad were dispatched by butchers who came to chop them to pieces. Some survived that even, and all of them were thrown into a well. Hundreds of British people were massacred. A massacre is a brutal slaughter. In the Bibigar massacre, in the fighting that came before that, in the sieges at Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi, etc. And fighting was just incredibly brutal. Why were the Indian soldiers so ready to chop women and children into pieces? Why were they so ready to shoot at people trying to get water from a well? After 100 years of mistreatment, of famine, of poverty, of disrespect on the part of the British, hassling and harassing the Indian people. In the case of Jhansi and Rani Lakshmi Bai, she's going to be upset about the implementation of the doctrine of lapse, where the British tried to take over kingdom after kingdom as soon as the male heir died. British women were not entirely innocent. Many of whom had Indian servants that they treated poorly over the years of British occupation. And so the fighting was brutal for all these reasons and more. The Indian people felt ready for revenge. After 100 years of oppression, If you recall, the Battle of Plassey was in 1757. This is exactly 100 years later. And they were ready for revenge. But that revenge was then avenged. Why was the British response to the Indian demands for independence so violent? So the Indian people demanded independence and they fought the British pretty violently. The British cracked down even more violently. If you thought that those massacres and attacks were horrible, the British were going to respond with even more vengeance. The British East India Company was not alone against the Bengal Regiment. They had, as we said before, 3 other regiments from Bombay and Madras, and the new Punjab Sikh regiments. It took about 6 months, but eventually the British Navy was able to send reinforcements. It took 6 months because they came all the way from England. And once the British had enough forces relocated from the peaceful areas to the combative north, they cracked down on the rebels with no mercy. Rebels were tortured, captured and tortured. One of the tortures was that the Indian captives were forced to lick the floors of slaughterhouses. Other captives were released from captivity, released from jail, told to run for their lives, and then shot in the back as they ran. And the most famous and probably most gruesome punishment, the punishment of blowing from a gun, which you see down here. Blowing from a gun is a punishment where the person is strapped to across the muzzle of a cannon. The cannon is then fired so that the person's torso is blown to pieces. And that way, not only is it a horrible, torturous death, and it's terrifying to witness, but the individual who's been blown to pieces can no longer have their body parts collected for burial or cremation in one place. Thus, hopefully, in the case of the British, robbing them of their eternal rest, robbing them of a place in heaven, robbing them of reincarnation in the Hindu system, punishing them for eternity. The British people, the British East India Company, had come to believe that the Indians had mutinied above their station in life. The British believed that the Indian people were still part of the British Empire, that they were owned by the British East India Company, and the British themselves had a right to control the Indian people. The British response was violent because they believed that the Indian people were supposed to remain under the control of Britain. The British did not see this as a rebellion or a revolution or a demand for independence. They saw it as a mutiny of people who were rebelling against their correct station in life. That's the end for today. Submit your summaries, and for homework, make sure to catch up on your HEI assignment called Siege and Massacres. And if you would like extra information, you can watch the summary of the Sepoy Mutiny video.